Are you writing a sequel or the second novel in a series? If so, this is the video for you. I'm going to give you all of my best advice for writing a sequel and share with you everything that I learned from writing my very first sequel this past year. You are going to walk away from this video with concrete, actionable writing tips that you can experiment with and see if it helps you out in your sequel writing and planning process. Writing advice is such a weird thing. Not one thing works for everybody, so my intention with this video is only to share what works for me in the hopes that it might also work for you. But before we get started, hello, welcome. My name is Claire Fraze, and I am an award-winning young adult author who makes videos on this channel sharing the actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. I published my debut dystopian novel Imperfect while I was in high school, so I make a lot of videos on this channel sharing my experience as a teen author and what it was like publishing a book at 16, and I'm also the author of They Stay, a young adult supernatural thriller, and the first in a series. So hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if any of this sounds interesting to you. Without further ado, let's get into the content. So the first thing that you need to do when writing a sequel is to plan out your series. This is super important because before writing a sequel, you need to have an understanding of how that sequel is going to fit into your overall series. How you approach writing the second installment in a duology, where there are only 2 books, is going to be different than how you approach writing the second installment to a 10-book series. So this requires you stepping back from book 1 and figuring out what story it is that you want to tell. Why does this have to be a series? Why did you want to make it a series? What is the big conflict that your characters could not solve in book 1? In order for your book to be a series, you need something that connects all of the books. This can take a bunch of different forms. You can have one crazy, enormous villain that takes 10 books to defeat. For example, in the Harry Potter books, Voldemort was a huge villain who took many books to defeat. If you have a villain who is extremely powerful, extremely hard to defeat, and maybe has a world domination plan, that is a conflict that may not be able to be resolved in just one book. If your villain or main character has a huge goal, like overthrowing the government, that is also something that could be stretched into multiple books because it would be hard to do that all in one book. You could also have what is known as a static series, where your main characters are the same, but they have to encounter a new conflict every single book. Examples of this include stories like Sherlock Holmes or James Bond. You could also have a city that keeps spitting out crazy supervillains that need to be defeated, and have one book dedicated to defeating each of these villains in a sort of static series. Or if you like to write mysteries or supernatural thrillers, you could follow the same main characters, and every book they need to go kill a different type of supernatural entity if they're like supernatural hunters. Or in a romance series, you could have all different members of the same family who live in the same place, all falling in love, and every single book shares their particular love story. There are a bunch of different ways that you can approach writing series, but you need to have something that ties all of your books together. For me, my series is what's known as a dynamic series, where every single book builds as the characters work towards overthrowing the same villain or resolving the same major conflict. Because of that, this video is going to focus more on those kinds of series instead of the static series where you can treat each book as a sort of standalone book, because while you do have the same main characters, those main characters don't quite change as much, and the villain that they confront every single book is different. So while you don't need to know every single thing that happens in every single book of your series, I highly recommend knowing at least the major arc of where your series is going to go. Are you going to have one giant villain major conflict that every single book is going to build up to? Are you going to have these sort of episodes where all of the different episodes are vaguely connected and then result in a conflict? Are you going to have completely unrelated episodes every book that don't resolve in like a major dynamic series conflict? In my case, I know the way that my series is going to end, as well as the major conflict or problem my main characters are going to have to solve in each of the 3 remaining books in my series in order to get them there. I know how the characters are going to develop and like what kind of people I want them to end as and how I want them to change. I know how their relationships are going to develop and, who's going to be with who and all of that stuff. But I don't know how they're going to figure out the mysteries in each of these books. I don't exactly know how they're going to get to their ending point yet, but I have the end goal in mind. So once you have a general idea of what your series is going to look like and know that maybe this is not the final installment, but the second out of 3 installments or the second out of 4 installments, then you can move on to the second step, which is figuring out how that book fits into your story. What is the next step that your characters have to take in order to get them to the ending that you have envisioned? Let's say, to make it simple, for the sake of this video, in order to defeat the big bad villain at the end of your 4th book, your characters need to find 2 really important objects. You have the first book where they maybe meet the villain for the first time, the second book where they find object 1, third book where they find object 2, and then in the 4th book they are able to combine the objects, create this massive explosion, and kill the final villain. Your second book would fit into that story because the next thing that your characters have to do after book 1 is find that first object. So that would become the conflict of book 2. I like to think of every book within a series having its own complete plot arc, and also the entire series having its own complete plot arc. For example, if you follow the hero's journey, I like to think of every single book in your series having a complete hero's journey, and then your entire series also having a complete hero's journey. In the Harry Potter books, every single book has its own mystery or task or tournament with its own big showdown at the end of the book. But each of these big showdowns leads up and builds in intensity until you get to the final showdown in the 7th book. You want to keep this in mind when planning your sequel, because you want the climax of your sequel to be more intense than the climax of book 1, but in a slightly different way. Don't go overboard, but like every single book leading up to your final showdown is just slightly more intense, and then you have the big final showdown at the end. Each of the smaller climaxes in your books end up delivering a piece of information to your characters that they didn't have before, equipping them with a skill they didn't have before, changing them in some way that makes them more prepared for their final showdown at the end. So once you have an idea of where your series is going, how your second book fits into that series, then you can move on to creating a complete individual standalone arc for your story. By standalone, I don't mean that people can read the second book without ever reading the first book because, that might be confusing because these 2 things build on each other. I'm talking standalone as in like some time has passed in between when your readers have read book 1 and book 2. So you need to have a beginning that isn't picking up immediately where the last one left off and helps reorient your readers in what happened in book 1. I know in the first draft of my sequel, I started off literally in the middle of the same scene that I cut off book 1 in. This would be fine if you were binging the whole series, but I realized that the people who have waited a couple of months will be super confused as to what's happening, so I ended up having to have more of an ordinary world beginning to lead people into what's going to ultimately happen in that chapter. So if you use the 3-act structure or the hero's journey for book 1, I would recommend also doing that for book 2 and treating it like it is its own independent adventure that advances the plot in some way. It isn't just a continuation of events from book 1. So then once you've figured out which overall plot structure you want to use, it's time to think about the actual plot. And you want the plot of this book to be very similar to book 1, but you want it to also be different. I know this sounds stupid, but let me explain. Readers fell in love with your story in book 1 for a reason. They picked up book 2 because they were intrigued by book 1. You want to make sure that your sequel echoes what you did in book 1, at least echoes the parts of book 1 that your readers fell in love with. For example, my favorite sequel of all time is Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins. I think that this sequel is a fantastic second installment to The Hunger Games because they take what was so interesting and riveting and terrifying about The Hunger Games, which was the fight to the death itself, and put it in book 2, but raise the stakes. They still have a fight to the death in book 2, but the people who are fighting are more experienced, which makes them more scary, and all of the things that happen in the arena have real-life political consequences, which they didn't have in book 1. For those of you who don't know, The Hunger Games is the story of a girl who finds herself in a battle royale type fight to the death with 23 other teenagers. 24 of them go in, only one comes out, and it's all broadcast on live television. This is the main hook of The Hunger Games. If Suzanne Collins had abandoned this and had the second book be mainly focused on what life was like after The Hunger Games was over, in the village, and there was some tension with the boys and maybe some government creepy stuff, it wouldn't have been as exciting as it was to put all of the characters back into the games and make the games more intense. Technically, it's the same conflict, but Suzanne Collins raised the stakes. So it's the same, but it's also different. In my case, my book is about a girl whose little brother goes missing, and she has to find him with the help of a girl who can see ghosts, and it turns out that his disappearance is linked to a bunch of paranormal stuff. If I had written a sequel to that book, and instead of having, maybe another kid go missing or like 2 more kids go missing and have it be like, in the same vein as what happened in book 1, if instead I had, a crazy alien invasion and all of the aliens tried to take over their town and the girl who could see ghosts was actually an alien and like there was a big alien human fight in the town, that would not have been the same. That would have been a complete deviation from what I had written in book 1, and it would leave the readers who are reading book 2 because they liked what happened in book 1 feeling very confused. So you need to find a way to do what you did in book 1 again, but somehow make it more intense. I know that this sounds vague, but I promise you that it's possible. I write thrillers, so a lot of turning up the stakes means, maybe more people are at risk of dying and things like that. But this can look very different depending on your genre. Some things to look out for are maybe ways that close characters to the main character can be at stake. Maybe the main character themselves is at stake this time. Maybe the serial killer has an even crazier plan to kill even more people. The next thing that you have to do is start thinking about how you want your characters to develop in this next book. You have to start thinking about your character arcs for your series and how you want them to change as people from the beginning of your series to the very end. Do you want characters who are cowardly to become more brave? Do you want characters who believe that they're unlovable to find love and be able to fall in love? Do you want characters who really despise themselves learn to accept and love themselves? What kind of change do you want to see? And how can you show this change gradually happening in the story? And what kind of events in your story can help to prompt that change in your character? You want to start to map out a big picture in your head where you want the characters to go, because characters evolve when things happen to them. And if you have a really crazy adventure that they're about to go on, they're going to come out of that adventure different people. That's important to know when you're working on your sequel, because you don't want to write characters that end up being lesser versions of the people they were in book 1, or versions of themselves that are mean or annoying or whiny when maybe they were really lovable characters in book 1. And finally, especially if you're writing thrillers, pay very careful attention to the pacing of your sequel. It is very often that sequels are less exciting than book 1 because people already know the characters, there isn't a lot of, brand new shiny syndrome going on, so you need to work harder as an author to keep readers invested and make them care about what's happening in the sequel. I was really careful about keeping my sequel tightly paced because I didn't want to include stuff that might be boring. Also, keep in mind that when you start writing, things are going to change. Maybe you map out your entire series, but when you start writing and exploring other things, you will get new ideas that will impact the direction of your series. This is okay. This is normal. This is actually very good because oftentimes once you start writing, you get better ideas than you had before you started writing. But having a sort of general idea for where you want to take things does save you time and make your early drafts better than they would be otherwise. This feedback also is obviously very geared towards people who like to plot things out. I am a hardcore plotter, so the advice that I'm giving you now is coming from someone who loves outlines. If you are a hardcore pantser and you don't like outlines at all, then probably what I just told you is not very helpful, but I would still challenge you to have a vague idea or maybe, a couple of sentences about where things are generally going to go, because it's going to make things a lot easier when you can foreshadow events that are happening later and you don't write yourself into corners in earlier books in the series when you want to pull something big off later. So that's how I would approach writing a sequel if I had to approach writing a sequel today. I hope that this was helpful to you. I typically try to make my advice videos more specific than this one and really dig into examples, but it's hard to do that for a topic like this because every single sequel and book is different. If there is a sequel-related writing topic that you want to see me talk about more, drop a comment down below and let me know. Again, I can only speak from my experience, which is writing dynamic series, and I haven't finished a whole series yet. I've just written book 1 and book 2. So take my advice as what you will. Experiment with what I tried if you think that it would be helpful to you, or don't. Completely up to you. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a like and to subscribe to my channel. I hope you have a good week, everybody, and as always, happy writing.